Most Americans believe pensions are boring, slow, and safe, designed to quietly protect retirement years ahead. They imagine predictable checks, steady growth, and professional managers guarding decades of earned savings carefully. What they rarely see is the machinery underneath, where assumptions quietly replace guarantees without announcement. Pensions do not promise safety. They promise expectations, and expectations break faster than contracts during crises. The word pension sounds old, stable, and protected by law, like something politicians would never endanger. But modern pensions are financial structures, not vaults, built on projections, markets, and political discipline. They rely on future returns to pay present promises, a delicate timing problem disguised as long-term certainty. When that timing slips, the risk does not vanish. It transfers silently to retirees and workers. To understand the danger, you must understand how pensions actually work beneath reassuring annual statements. Most pensions are not piles of saved cash waiting for retirees to withdraw slowly over time. They are investment pools betting on decades of market growth, interest rates, and uninterrupted contributions. If any pillar weakens, the entire structure strains, regardless of promises printed on official documents. Public pensions begin with an assumption, usually around 7% annual returns, compounded forever into the future. That assumption allows governments to promise benefits today without fully funding them immediately. If returns fall short, the gap grows quietly, hidden behind accounting language and political optimism. Taxpayers and retirees eventually absorb the difference when reality arrives, often suddenly and painfully. Private pensions and retirement funds operate differently, but they share the same exposure to market behavior. 401k plans shift risk directly onto workers, tying retirement security to stock and bond market performance. In good decades, balances rise, reinforcing faith in the system and encouraging greater participation. In bad decades, losses compound precisely when workers have least time to recover. Inflation is the most underestimated threat inside retirement systems because it erodes value invisibly and gradually. A pension paying fixed dollars loses purchasing power every year. Prices rise faster than adjustments. Even modest inflation can have real retirement income cross 20 or 30 years of retirement. Official cost of living adjustments rarely match lived expenses like healthcare, housing, and energy. Healthcare costs deserve special attention because retirees spend more on medical care than any other category. Pensions rarely adjust benefits to reflect medical inflation, which historically outpaces general inflation significantly. Retirees discover that stable income buys less healthcare every passing year without dramatic warning signs. The loss feels personal, but the cause is structural and predictable. Underfunding is the silent disease of public pensions across American states and municipalities. Governments postpone contributions during good years, assuming future growth will compensate for present shortfalls. Politicians prefer visible spending today over invisible obligations decades later, especially near elections. The unpaid bill accumulates interest, compounding quietly until it becomes politically impossible to ignore. Detroit's bankruptcy exposed this reality brutally. When pension promises collided with fiscal collapse, retirees learned that legal protections weaken when governments themselves cannot pay their obligations. Courts balanced bondholders, city services, and pensioners, proving retirement income is not untouchable. What seemed guaranteed became negotiable under emergency financial conditions. Corporate pensions carry different risks, but they are not immune to failure or restructuring pressures. When companies collapse, pensions become liabilities competing with creditors for limited remaining assets. Federal insurance exists, but it caps benefits and rarely replaces full promised income. Workers discover protection only covers part of what they believed was guaranteed for life. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation sounds reassuring, but its limits matter more than its name. High earners, long-tenured workers, and executives often lose significant portions of promised benefits. The system protects against total collapse, not against painful reductions in expected retirement lifestyles. Insurance transforms disaster into disappointment, not security into certainty. Interest rates play a hidden role in pension stability, influencing both asset values and future obligations. Low interest rates increase the present value of future pension payments, expanding funding gaps dramatically. At the same time, low yields reduce investment income, forcing funds toward riskier assets. This pushes pensions into equities, private equity, and alternatives precisely when caution would suggest restraint. Private equity exposure introduces complexity most retirees never realize exists within their pension statements. Illiquid assets promise higher returns but depend on favorable markets and buyer demand years later. During downturns, valuations lag reality, masking losses until assets must be sold. The delay creates false confidence, followed by abrupt corrections when cash becomes necessary. Demographics amplify these problems as populations age and fewer workers support more retirees. Pension systems built for growing workforces struggle under shrinking contributor bases and longer lifespans. Each retiree now draws benefits longer than models originally anticipated decades earlier. Longevity is a success story for humanity, but a stress test for retirement mathematics. Political pressure complicates reform because no one wants to admit promises exceed feasible funding. Reducing benefits angers voters. Raising taxes angers taxpayers. Acknowledging reality angers everyone. So leaders delay, refinance obligations, and hope growth outpaces arithmetic one more cycle. Hope becomes policy, and policy becomes risk carried by people least able to absorb it. Market crashes accelerate these tensions by shrinking assets, while obligations remain unchanged. Funds lose value precisely when governments face declining tax revenue and rising social expenses. The temptation to defer contributions grows, widening future gaps and increasing long-term fragility. Crises compress decades of mismanagement into sudden, visible consequences. Many retirees assume diversification inside pension funds protects against severe outcomes. Diversification reduces volatility, but it cannot eliminate systemic risk affecting all assets simultaneously. When correlations rise during crises, diversified portfolios fall together, not separately. Protection disappears exactly when it is most needed. Legal language surrounding pensions often creates false confidence through complexity and conditional guarantees. Benefits are promised subject to funding status, legislative changes, and emergency provisions. The fine print matters more than the headline promise, but few beneficiaries read it. Understanding arrives late, usually after options have narrowed significantly. Cultural trust in institutions reinforces complacency around retirement systems and long-term obligations. Americans grew up believing pensions were conservative, boring, and fundamentally protected structures. That belief persists despite repeated historical evidence of adjustments, cuts, and restructurings. Memory fades faster than obligations accumulate, resetting expectations each generation. Financial repression quietly transfers pension risk through suppressed interest rates and controlled markets. By keeping yields low, governments reduce borrowing costs while increasing pressure on retirement returns. Pension funds stretch into riskier strategies to meet targets politicians prefer not revising. The system balances itself by increasing exposure, not by reducing promises. Accounting standards allow optimistic assumptions to persist longer than reality would permit in private markets. Public pensions discount liabilities using expected returns rather than safer market-based rates. This makes funding appear healthier than it truly is under conservative valuation methods. The gap remains theoretical until cash demands expose the difference unmistakably. International examples reinforce that pension stress is not hypothetical or uniquely American. Greece, Italy, and other nations adjusted benefits when debt burdens overwhelmed fiscal capacity. Retirees experienced reductions, delayed payments, or increased taxation during restructuring efforts. Global patterns show retirement systems bend under pressure. Regardless of political assurances, The uncomfortable truth is pensions depend on uninterrupted economic growth and political discipline. Neither condition persists indefinitely across decades, wars, recessions, and demographic shifts. Systems designed under optimistic assumptions struggle when reality deviates persistently downward. The risk compounds quietly until sudden adjustments restore balance by force, rather than planning. Most workers focus on contribution rates and balances, not funding ratios and actuarial assumptions. They track account statements but rarely analyze systemic sustainability or political incentives behind them. This asymmetry benefits institutions managing expectations rather than guaranteeing outcomes. Awareness remains the first defense against surprise, but it arrives late for many. Trust is not misplaced entirely, but it is incomplete without understanding underlying mechanics. Pensions can function, but only when assumptions align with reality and adjustments occur early. Ignoring risk does not remove it. It simply concentrates consequences later. Retirement security requires vigilance, not faith alone, especially in complex financial systems. Crises do not create pension risk. They reveal it when timing, liquidity, and confidence collapse together. Markets fall, revenues shrink, and suddenly assumptions must face arithmetic without political cushioning. At that moment, pensions stop being long-term ideas and become immediate cash flow problems. Who absorbs the shock depends on leverage and who lacks bargaining power. History shows pensions rarely fail loudly. They are adjusted quietly through freezes, delays, and recalculations. Benefits are trimmed, cost of living increases pause, retirement age is nudged upward without dramatic announcements. Each change seems minor alone, but collectively, they reshape promised futures beyond recognition. Retirees feel poorer without ever hearing the word default spoken publicly. Governments prefer indirect methods because outright cuts trigger backlash and legal challenges instantly. Instead, inflation does the work invisibly, reducing real value while nominal payments continue. This method avoids headlines while accomplishing fiscal relief. Over time, inflation becomes the most politically efficient pension haircut ever invented. Asset allocation shifts during crises often lock in losses while preserving appearances. Temporarily, funds sell liquid assets to meet payments, leaving illiquid investments dominating portfolios. Future flexibility disappears as options narrow, increasing dependency on market recovery timing. Retirees unknowingly inherit a more fragile system after each downturn. When funding gaps widen, contribution burdens shift toward active workers and taxpayers. Younger generations pay more for benefits they may never fully receive themselves. This intergenerational transfer breeds resentment, undermining political support for pension systems. Solidarity erodes as arithmetic becomes unavoidable and trust fractures. Legal protections surrounding pensions vary widely, despite similar comforting language across jurisdictions. Some states protect benefits strongly, others allow adjustments under fiscal emergency statutes. Court rulings consistently prioritize system survival over individual expectations during insolvency. Rights exist until resources disappear, then hierarchy replaces principle. Private retirement accounts face different threats, but they are not safer in systemic downturns. Market crashes reduce balances immediately, forcing delayed retirements or reduced lifestyles. Sequence of returns risk punishes those unlucky enough to retire during downturns. Timing, not discipline, determines outcomes more than most financial advice admits. Target date funds promise simplicity, but hide concentration risks tied to market cycles. They rebalance automatically, sometimes selling growth assets after declines, locking losses. Design assumes normal recoveries, not prolonged stagnation or structural economic shifts. Automation replaces judgment, with consequences rarely explained to participants beforehand. The illusion of diversification collapses when global markets synchronize under shared stress. Stocks fall together, bonds fail to hedge, and alternatives freeze liquidity. What looked balanced becomes uniformly fragile during extreme conditions. Protection promised by models dissolves when correlations approach 1. Central banks intervene aggressively to stabilize markets, but their actions distort retirement outcomes. Low rates inflate asset prices, benefiting current holders while reducing future return potential. Pension funds chase yield harder, increasing risk exposure system-wide. Stability today is purchased with fragility tomorrow, deferred through policy. Financial repression becomes permanent when exit appears too dangerous for the system. Savings earn less, forcing retirement systems to depend on appreciation rather than income. This shifts risk from institutions to individuals without explicit consent. Security transforms into speculation under bureaucratic management. Political narratives frame pensions as untouchable to preserve confidence and social calm. But history shows every major fiscal crisis eventually reaches retirement promises. The timing varies, the mechanism changes, but the destination repeats. Belief delays reckoning. Arithmetic eventually demands resolution. The real vulnerability lies not in pensions themselves, but in expectations built around them. People plan lives assuming checks will arrive unchanged for decades. Few build contingencies for partial fulfillment or delayed access. That rigidity turns adjustment into trauma instead of manageable transition. Resilience requires understanding pensions as one component, not the foundation. Retirement security, supplemental savings, skills, flexibility, and reduced fixed obligations matter more than projections. Diversifying income sources matters more than diversifying asset classes alone. Control, not yield, determines survival during systemic stress. Those who fare best in pension crises are not the wealthiest, but the most adaptable. They adjust spending or locate, work part-time, or monetize skills when assumptions fail. Rigid lifestyles collapse faster than balanced portfolios ever could. Behavioral flexibility outperforms financial engineering when systems strain. Preparation does not mean abandoning pensions, but demystifying them realistically. Understanding funding ratios, political incentives, and macroeconomic pressures reduces shock. Awareness restores agency where blind trust removes it. Clarity arrives before crises for those willing to look early. Retirement security has always been negotiated between growth, discipline, and honesty. When anyone disappears, promises stretch beyond sustainable limits. The cost is paid later by those least prepared to respond quickly. History does not punish optimism, but it punishes ignorance relentlessly. The uncomfortable conclusion is not despair, but responsibility returning to individuals. Institutions manage systems. People manage survival within them. The earlier this shift is accepted, the less painful adjustment becomes. Reality rewards foresight, not faith, especially when decades are at stake. Pensions will not vanish overnight, but they will change gradually under pressure. The direction of change favors flexibility, not certainty or permanence. Understanding this transforms fear into strategy rather than paralysis. Prepared minds suffer less when systems rewrite their rules. If this story gave you a new way to see retirement, risk, and power, subscribe. History doesn't warn loudly, but it always leaves clues for those listening carefully.